The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
Many nations across the world are experiencing China's increased engagement in their economies and societies, most notably through the far-reaching Belt and Road Initiative. South Asia is a dynamic region in which the Chinese presence has rapidly expanded, offering attractive opportunities even as it faces serious challenges. Join our live discussion, bringing your own views and challenges for our panel of experts on Tuesday, March 7, 2023, 2 to 4 p.m. UK time.
To our Democracy Forum debate on a critical issue about China's expansion and its focus on South Asia. Is it investment or is it exploitation? Or is it a mix of what over the millennia rising powers do to stretch influence way beyond their borders? What is South Asia's view? China-reliant Pakistan, China big power rival India, China indebted Sri Lanka, and so on. And is Foreign Minister Jin Gang right when this morning he described China as a force for global stability and prosperity, inspiring modernization around the world, particularly in the global south? He said China's achievements bust the myth that modernization is westernization. A big thought for South Asia, which over its decades since decolonization has struggled with the concept of Western democracy. To untangle all this, we have a fantastic Democracy Forum panel: Frédéric, Pervez, Hoodbhoy, Christine Fair, and Christopher Clary. Democracy Forum Chair Barry Gardiner, MP, is following our debate and is a veteran of Asian issues, and he will give his assessment at the end. And as always, to give us the canvas and background to our discussion, we go to the President of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar, which will focus on China's role as a primary source of development finance to countries in South Asia. Previous webinars have looked at the quantum and impact of China's model of international development, while also exposing evidence of foreign policy collusion. Today, we've asked our panel to consider if China is following a broadly positive program of investment in public infrastructure to spread the benefits of economic growth, or conversely, if it is pursuing a process which may amount to colonialism by default. I'm very grateful to the team at TDF for arranging this event and for securing the participation of such an eminent group of panelists. I thank them all for agreeing to take part, and I thank Humphrey Hawksley for taking the role of moderator. In an article published last week, The Economist magazine reviewed the steady accumulation of Chinese foreign direct investment, concluding that the world now owes China's 8 largest state-owned banks at least $1.6 trillion, which is equivalent to 2% of global GDP. Further evidence published by Aid Data, a research center based in Virginia, reveals that over the last 5 years, China's commitment to international development finance has been hovering at around $85 billion per annum, outspending the United States and other large providers by a factor of 2 to 1. There are now at least 40 low and middle income countries whose exposure to Chinese state-owned lenders is worth at least 10% of their GDP. Moreover, many of these countries are actually underreporting the scale of the debt repayment obligations by an amount equivalent to an additional 5.8% of GDP. Altogether, these underreported debts are worth approximately $385 billion, concludes aid data. In trying to determine if this program may be best described as investment or exploitation, it's worth bearing in mind that China is currently pursuing a ratio of loans to grants in the order of 31 to 1, priced at relatively high interest rates. But unsurprisingly, perhaps, around 36% of all loan programs started under the Belt and Road Initiative since 2013 have encountered a relatively high level of implementation problems. Invariably, these are characterized by corruption scandals, labor violation, environmental hazards, and public protest. Indeed, some researchers have revealed that Chinese lenders have actually, I quote, scaled up the provision of foreign currency denominated loans to resource-rich countries that suffer from high levels of corruption. Why? Because these loans are collateralized against future commodity export receipts to minimize repayment and fiduciary risk, and in the interest of securing energy and natural resources lacking in sufficient quantities at home and maximizing investment returns on surplus dollars and euros. The relationship between Bangladesh and China is a case in point. In 2015, the Chinese ambassador Ma Minqiang announced the creation of 2 special enterprise zones at a cost of $4.5 billion. The following year, a state visit to Dhaka by President Xi Jinping resulted in 27 loan agreements totaling $24 billion, comprising an extensive shopping list of infrastructure projects. China is also a major arms supplier to Bangladesh, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, accounting for 70% of Bangladeshi arms purchases and 20% of total arms exported by China between 2016 and 2020. But it's not entirely clear what diplomatic leverage China expects to exert from this relationship. In May 2021, at a meeting of the Bangladesh Diplomatic Correspondents Association, the Chinese ambassador Li Jiming used the occasion to announce a gift of 500,000 doses of coronavirus vaccines. However, he let his mask slip somewhat by warning his hosts that their country's relationship would suffer, I quote, substantial damage if Bangladesh joined the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the Quad, the informal alliance linking the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. The Bangladesh Foreign Minister, A.K. Abdul Momen, was quick to respond, telling reporters, I quote, "We are an independent and sovereign state. We decide our own foreign policy." And reporting in November last year on another indebted South Asian economy, Reuters revealed that Sri Lanka's accumulated loan obligations to China have reached 20% of its total public external debt, which is estimated to be in the region of $40 billion. With an annual interest payment bill equivalent to 7% of GDP. As we featured in an earlier webinar, Sri Lanka defaulted on its international debt in April last year, the first country in the Asian Pacific region to do so since Pakistan in 1999. But China has been slow to cooperate with other lenders to provide refinancing assurances in order to finalize an IMF assistance program. This was claimed by the Financial Times last week. This intransigence risks undermining the preferred creditor status of the World Bank and the IMF, which is likely to reduce their capacity to provide loans in future to poorer countries at lower rates of interest. At Chatham House, the senior research fellow, UG, maintains that Beijing will always pursue the best outcome for itself over collective action. I quote, "That has always been the way and it will never change," he said. And nowhere is this more evident than Pakistan, where total public debt currently stands at $270 billion, around 80% of GDP. Pakistan's biggest bilateral creditor, China, holds around $30 billion of its total debt, but shows a similar reluctance to cooperate with refinancing, as it has demonstrated with Sri Lanka. Pakistan is additionally hobbled by the contractual obligations it has accumulated under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, particularly the capacity payments demanded by Chinese independent power producers, the IPPs, which are owed over $9 billion. Yusuf Nazar, an emerging market specialist, asks pointedly, I quote, "Pakistan is squeezed between IMF demands and Chinese interests. Rescheduling debts will provide some relief, but who will bite the bullet first?" Or as The Economist puts it, China's money goes to two kinds of borrowers. Those with a good chance of repaying, either because projects are likely to turn a profit or governments are sufficiently rich, or those for which any lost money represents a price worth paying for diplomatic advantage. In the case of South Asia, it looks as if China's international development criteria will always favor the second category of borrower. Well, welcome to the webinar, and I hope you enjoy listening to the proceedings. Please put any questions or points to the chair.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, for those thoughts. We are an independent and sovereign state. We decide our own foreign policy, says Bangladesh. But is any nation when you have a bigger nation on your doorsteps? As Charles says, put your comments, questions, criticisms, thoughts into the comments, and we will feed it into our conversation. We're going to begin with Frédéric Grare, Senior Policy Fellow on the Asia Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And his latest book, out last year, is The Indian Ocean as a New Political and Security Region. He's going to give us an overall encompassing view. So Francis Grare, tell us how China's investment or exploitation fits into your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, sir. My thoughts are about security, as I was requested to do, and therefore the term investment and exploitation do fit in, but only in a certain angle. But let me start by making some general remarks. I mean, China's involvement in South Asia security complex is a reality and a growing reality. We never even spoken about it 20 years ago. This is now something which is still evolving and which is at the same time multidimensional. Yet, not every country in South Asia feels the same way in China's willingness to impose its hegemony over the region, and the way the security relationship is developed with varies from country to country. It is therefore important not to overgeneralize the region, and above all, countries with such gaps in capacity with their patron state are likely to face challenges no matter what. But it's also important to note that the very concept of security has evolved. I'm not talking of any theory of sort, but of the reality on the ground. I mean, the military dimension persists, of course, but the key word is increasingly the hybridization of threat. And that's where the topic that I've been asked to address meets what the general subject of the conference, which is about China and South Asia, investment or exploitation. So let me come back to the concept of hybrid threat. This is a mix of military and non-military, covert and overt activity by state and non-state actors that occurs below the line of conventional warfare. The consequence for individual nations include weakened institutions, disrupted social system and economies, and greater vulnerability to coercion. And that's exactly where we are right now in South Asia security relationship with China. But we can identify sort of three tiers in China's approach. One which is about the stability of its periphery, the typical example here being Afghanistan, and I won't elaborate on it because Chris will develop it later. One which has primarily to do with China's rivalry with India and its willingness to constrain Delhi, hence the pressure on the Himalayan border, and the Sino-Indian border era will continue being a major flashpoint. And so also China's relation with India's neighbors. Clearly, relations with Pakistan fall within this category. Backing Pakistan helps China constrain Indian power in Asia, but the most evolution of the last 10 to 15 years has been that Pakistan is by no means the sole clients of China in South Asia anymore. And Lord Bruce has underlined the security relationship between Bangladesh and China. This is one such example. And the last tier that I'd like to mention briefly, although I won't develop it, has to do with India, but through with China's relationship with the US. How China's relationship with India affect India's relationship with the US and vice versa. Overall, China does not necessarily pursue one objective at once when it deals in security matters with South Asia, but very often with several. Clearly, when we speak of Galwan, the message that China was trying to sell was threefold. A, tell India there is not much the US can do for it. To tell the US that the idea of India, as a balancer to China may not be such a good idea after all. And finally, it is meant to tell the smaller state in South Asia that there is not much to expect from India in actual security terms. The truth is that all these messages are debatable. I'm not saying that they're wrong, I'm saying that they are debatable, but the intention is clear and has everything to do with China's willingness to assert itself as the hegemonic power in the entire Asia, including, of course, South Asia. Now, if we look at the way China has been pursuing its objective, we see that China has used over time every single type of activity from overt war, 1962, to war by proxies, the support of Pakistan, or even the separatist movement in the Northeast, arms supplies, both conventional and non-conventional. I'm referring, of course, to the design of the nuclear device delivered to Pakistan in 1982. And as was mentioned before, today, China happens to be the first supplier of weapons to Bangladesh. China arms make up to over 70% of Bangladesh's major arms purchases. And I won't go into detail, I will just mention that in 2016, Bangladesh procured 2 diesel-electric submarines from China for something like $186 million. Now, China is also having a growing focus on a blue water navy and power projection to the Far Sea, which is a relatively new phenomenon. But the most interesting thing, which has been developing over the past few years, and the one that is the most related to the overall theme of the conference today, is that China is now developing its own influence by other means. It wants to expand its influence, of course, for its own sake, but also force India to devote time and resources to its neighborhood rather than to project influence into East Asia. So this is, of course, a contest of influence, but which does occasionally translate into strategic one. What we have seen emerging over the past few years is the weaponization of simply every sector of activity. So far, what we had was sort of a commercial influence. Now we're talking of influence in all sectors. The truth, and if we have influence in all sectors, it means that we speak of connectivity as a powerful weapon. We speak of the environment as a potential weapon. We speak of just every activity as the potential weapon. How does the mechanism play? It does play through the dependency question. The dependency question means that if you are, for example, the Maldives and wants to fight against climate change, it means you have to transition your energy system. It means that you have to invest. If you invest, you get into debt. If you get into debt, you get into dependency. And if you get into dependency, your dependency becomes what your creditor wants it to become. So there comes the strategic dimension of it, especially when China is a country ready to seize assets in order to get repaid. The same thing happened in Hambantota. Hambantota, the Chinese get a lease for 99 years with potential consequences for Sri Lanka's immediate neighbor, India, and that has created a source of insecurity in the entire neighborhood. Clearly, the issue is not just a financial one. Smaller South Asian states, which have their own interests and the agency pursues them, are persuaded they can play this sort of great power rivalry to their benefits. Well, whether they're capable or not of doing so is a major question, and as certainly a key question in the context that we're facing, because if we can say that Bangladesh so far has not managed too badly, this is highly debatable when it comes, for example, to Sri Lanka, and we still have to see how Nepal will evolve. And of course, we come to the usual question of, is China pursuing a debt trap diplomacy? Well, that's an interesting question. This is a question which is highly debated because a few publications recently, well, not so recently, I said, no, it's not. And it's certainly not in the sense that it is, that it would mean that China would be deliberately trying to put countries into debt in order to better control them. As I said just earlier, there is clearly local responsibility. China is not responsible for the mismanagement of the economy. When we speak of the Chinese debt in Sri Lanka, the Chinese debt was not that much that he was the sole responsible for the situation in which the country ended up last year. So the local responsibility was there. Now it doesn't mean that China is not playing opportunistically on the kind of debt that it did contribute to generate, and that's where the coercion can start. We have observed it in Sri Lanka. I don't know to what extent we can say we observe the same thing in Pakistan, but the question can certainly be asked, and the question will certainly be asked by different quarters of the society, including by the military. But in any case, China cannot be held responsible for the local mismanagement of the local elite or for the ill-conceived project that had led to the debt in question and has opened up advantages for China. But China has clearly been able to play this ball. Most Western countries have understood where the danger lies and are reacting accordingly. And I'll stop on this. Sorry if I was not always totally clear.
No, that was fascinating. I just have a personal question, then a couple of questions from the audience, Frédéric. We're talking a lot about China indebting nations and the debt problems therein. Back in the 70s and 80s, it was the Western banks and countries that were lending, and there was also a debt problem there. Could you give us an idea of how that compares?
That's the eternal question. I think it's a fair question. First of all, let's start from the premise that international relation is not the fight of the good versus the ugly. This is definitely about national interest. Now, we see China's influence growing through this debt policy, and clearly that makes us uncomfortable. That probably makes a lot of countries in the region also uncomfortable, because the big difference between the two is the willingness to coerce countries into doing what we want. So I would certainly not argue that all Western countries have been absolutely innocent in the way they manage their debt. But there is also a degree, and when we speak of like-minded countries, of value-based diplomacy and so on, that's also what we are referring to. So I don't want to put the two on par. There is definitely an element of comparison, but at the end of the day, if you are on the receiving end, you have to ask yourself, in which situation am I better off?
Yes, and Anand Tomar has a question here, which I think is that you were talking about influence in all sectors. The question is, since China is quite a new influencer in South Asia, does Beijing fully understand the region culturally, and does the region get China?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and I think that, well, again, you can ask the same question to everybody who is dealing with South Asia. Is the US getting South Asia completely, and is South Asia getting the US completely? Can't we say the same thing about Europe and so on? At the end of the day, I think that to some extent it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter because this is what you do and the consequences of what you do, which really matters. And therefore, whether China is well or not so well intentioned or missing some point does matter much less than the kind of consequences it does generate for the country which are concerned.
Yes, because in my experience working around South Asia and Asia generally is that whatever the rivalry between the superpowers, there's always this penchant to prefer the baseball cap, say, to the Mao cap, and that sort of pull of Hollywood. And I think that's a little bit in this question here, is that, people seem to get America or get the dream, but they don't quite get the China dream. Would that be a fair assessment?
I don't know. I think people think they get the American dream. This is not exactly the same thing as really getting it and what it means. But I see your point, but I'm not sure it does really matter at the end of the day.
Okay, and the last question I'm putting to you, because with your security hat from Prashant Kumar, with shifting attitudes and power bases, does South Asia still need long-term US engagement?
Well, if you ask the South Asian, and if you look at what they do, they're all looking for US engagement. They don't want it too close, but they want it close enough in order to balance either China, either the US and China, and so on. That applies to Pakistan as well, which has had a very, very difficult time with the US, but which is clearly trying to get back in the good ticket of Washington recently. And I see of no real state trying to really get away from it. Yes, states in South Asia want a closer US engagement.
Yes, I see. So they don't want to be like Europe, where in Europe we are totally reliant on the US to do our things. They want a little bit more independence, do they?
Well, but you can say that, that's always the same thing when we speak about India. India has this concept of strategic autonomy, like some Europeans do, the French in particular. But strategic autonomy has never meant strategic autarky. Strategic autonomy has not precluded countries, neither in Europe nor in South Asia, to cooperate with the US. And the tendency, the trend that we have been observing over the past 30 years in reality, not just recently, has been, even for India, a rapprochement with the US, which has been confirmed presidency after presidency, irrespective of the color of the administration at the time.
Thank you so much for that. And please stay with us, because we're going to dig deeper into this. And now we're going into a specific element of the South Asian narrative here with Dr. Christine Fair, Professor of Security Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Fair has served in a myriad of roles directly related to our topic, including United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan, the Combating of Terrorism Center at West Point, and the Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention, and China's role and interests in Afghanistan is what she is going to be talking to us today, because last month, I think the Chinese state-owned Xinjiang Central Asian Petroleum Company signed its first big contract in Afghanistan as part of a sort of return of investment there. So Dr. Christine Fair, give us your analysis.
I'm sorry. I have a really wobbly internet connection. So I'll try to be brief. So I'm really glad that Frédéric Grare, by the way, it's really nice to see you. I miss having you in DC, although I didn't seem to actually see you when you were there. I'm glad he raised the fact that China's relationship with the different countries in South Asia, they each need to be considered on their own terms. And I think Afghanistan in particular is one of these. I mean, Frédéric said that we weren't talking about China in South Asia 20 years ago, but actually some of us were when it came to Afghanistan, because China had been, on the eve of 9/11, the single most important investor in Afghanistan, right? So China's relationship with Afghanistan actually goes back to the Soviet invasion of the country, when the Chinese, along with the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, were supporting the so-called Mujahideen to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan. And in fact, in that period of time, the Chinese were quite supportive of their own Uyghur population going and fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. And this was a decision, like many countries, including the United States, that chose to side in this way, would prove that there'd be very large negative externalities of that policy. Because when those Uyghurs went home, these were Uyghurs that were battle-hardened, that had considerable expertise fighting a fairly competent army. And they also were part of this landscape of the jihad that had this narrative that, these scruffy mujahideen were able to hobble a superpower. So this became part of the animating behavior of the Uyghurs in their own quest for separatism from China. By the time we get to circa 1990, China is really realizing the implications of the policies that it had pursued in the previous years. So what we see happening in the middle of the 1990s is that China is trying to figure a way out of the mistakes that it had made. It launches the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was very much focused upon Islamist terrorism. But it's also when the Chinese really began to figure out its policy with respect to the Taliban. So from the Taliban's point of view, what China was essentially asking them was that they would stop supporting ETIM, or the Uyghur separatists. Now, there's some debate about the extent to which the Taliban did in fact honor those commitments, but the Chinese found what they were getting from the Taliban to be adequately credible, that they were the sole investor in Afghanistan in terms of building what one could at least call the extant, if negligible, telecommunications infrastructure that Afghanistan had. That was compliments of the Chinese. So on the eve of 9/11, China was basically the single most important actor in Afghanistan. And people might actually forget that on the eve of 9/11, China was actually similarly on the brink of signing a memorandum of understanding with Osama bin Laden. So for people of our age, 9/11 doesn't seem like yesterday. I'm aware that some people who might be listening to this were really quite young when 9/11 happened. So I think different participants in this conference are going to have different points of view on this. But I remember being at RAND, where I worked right after 9/11, and the revelation that China was that close to signing a memorandum of agreement with Al-Qaeda was pretty shocking. It was very disquieting. But if you go back and you listen to everything that Osama bin Laden had said up to that point, even beyond, including up to the point where he was killed by Navy SEALs, he never criticized China for what it was doing. And even though China's track record of brutalities, not only against Uyghur Muslims, but other Muslim populations in China was well known, you will not find a single Osama bin Laden take on that, right? So 9/11 happens, and China, quickly reoptimizes its strategy. It throws its support essentially behind what would be the internationally supported government in Afghanistan. But it never stopped supporting the Taliban, right? The Taliban, along with the Pakistanis, continued to argue that the Taliban were important political actors whose equities had to be considered. So China, very early on, going back to 2007, people might recall, it was the single largest investor in Afghanistan with the Ainak copper mine. There were other agreements that were made to, for example, develop the Amu Darya gas basin. And China came under considerable criticism for essentially being a free rider under the US NATO security umbrella. In fact, our former friend and colleague, Steve Cohen, I think very presciently remarked that China will fight to the last US Marine to make Afghanistan, the United States will fight to the last Marine to make Afghanistan exploitable by the Chinese. And I don't think he was entirely wrong. I think what he did do was he overestimated the ability of the Chinese to, in fact, exploit Afghanistan. So with the rise of Xi, of course, China became much more interested in Afghanistan. This is when China really began to effectuate with much more interest the BRI project. And one could have easily seen why Afghanistan would have been very natural, a natural player in the BRI. So, for example, if you are looking at the ring or the network of investments that China has made in Pakistan, I'm going to note very briefly, because I presume that Chris might talk about Pakistan in considerable detail. A lot of the focus on CPEC, the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or as I prefer to call it, colonizing Pakistan to enrich China corridor, are really focusing on these ground lines of communication to some extent, what has or has not happened in the power sector. But I think what the most important aspect of CPEC is something that gets no attention whatsoever, and that's the agricultural sector. And this is particularly dangerous for a country like Pakistan, which is under so much water pressure. Primarily, the crops that are being grown are intended to feed Chinese, not Pakistani. And while arguably, there are improvements in Pakistan's balance of trade with China through these agricultural deals, in the long term, you're essentially using up a very precious resource in Pakistan, which is water, with no obvious long-term benefit. But if you're looking at CPEC, it becomes immediately obvious why Afghanistan would be potentially important, right? There are about the estimates range between $1 to $3 trillion worth of untapped minerals in Afghanistan, right? So if you could get those minerals out of the ground and onto what was once the ring road and connected that effectively to Gardiner or even to Karachi, this would be, obviously the prospects of this were really quite enticing. And there's very little doubt that to considerable measure, China was hoping that it would be able to exploit those resources in Afghanistan. But what we've seen from the time that the Chinese made those investments up until the Taliban actually took over is that China wasn't able to get any of those minerals out of the ground. And if you consider, even at the height of the surge, when Afghanistan was, arguably, considerably stable to where it fell in more recent years, China wasn't even able to make the slightest impact, even during the height of the US NATO security umbrella. So now that the Taliban are in charge, China's calculus is very much the same. It's largely been over-promising, for example, the deal that you just noted, but that's by far the only deal that Chinese firms have inked in Afghanistan. I strongly suspect that the biggest obstacle to China's ability to profit from the resources in Afghanistan is going to be the instability that exists in Afghanistan. And if you're looking at the Islamic State, one of the principal ways that the Islamic State Khorasan province, which is to say the Islamic State in Afghanistan, the principal way that it is trying to distinguish itself from the Taliban, because remember, many of the ISKP commanders are themselves former Talibs, and they're basically doing the opposite of whatever the Taliban do. If you look at ISKP publications, as I've done, you see that ISKP, they are leveling their sights very much at the Chinese. So I think Afghanistan is going to be a very, very hard nut for the Chinese to crack. They weren't able to do it at the height of the US security umbrella. They're not going to be able to do it now. The Taliban are not going to be able to provide security. And so I think the Taliban, interestingly enough, they have really reposed a lot of hopes in the Chinese, because if the Chinese could get those resources out of the ground into the market, that would provide a really important source of budgetary support. Looking at Afghan's history, it's going to take about 10 plus years before there's going to be any significant challenge mounted to the Taliban. I would assess even longer than that, because the Northern Alliance has been completely eviscerated. There is no obvious cluster of significant resistance to the Taliban. And having said that, the Islamic State, they will create problems, but they're certainly not proposing an alternative to governance. So I think that while the Taliban are really hopeful that the Chinese are going to deliver, I don't anticipate that China is going to fare much better than it has over the last 20 years in Afghanistan. And that's it. Sorry.
Oh, that's it. Professor Christine Fair, thank you very much. But piques the curiosity also from one of our audience, if I could pitch this question to you, which I think you part answered. It's from Wen Min. Given the scale of instability and the extent of security challenges within Afghanistan, how do the panel, which others can answer this, foresee the viability of China's Belt and Road Initiative in the country in both the medium and long term?
So I, for one, and I'd be interested to hear what Chris and Frédéric have to say on this. I, for one, have never really seen this. Well, I'm going to separate this out, right, in a couple of dimensions. So in South Asia, BRI really depends heavily upon CPEC. So if you look at the ground lines of communication aspects of this, you're really talking about road linkages. And what's really going to be important is getting the linkage at the top where Gilgit-Baltistan meets Xinjiang. As a student, I had the opportunity to travel those roads. It's going to take a lot of moving of mountains to make that a viable transport corridor. It's very difficult to get eyes and ears in Gilgit-Baltistan, but whatever we do here coming out of Gilgit-Baltistan has really been one of protest of Chinese efforts. It was, in fact, the Chinese that were pushing very much for Gilgit-Baltistan to become a regularized province. So there's a lot of resistance there. There's a reason why the Pakistanis make it almost impossible to get news, because whatever does come out is not good news for CPEC. And then, of course, the other anchor to CPEC is Gardiner, which is in Balochistan. And if there's an organization more than the Islamic State that hates China more, it's probably the various Baloch organizations that have been resisting Chinese efforts there for a really long time. Gardiner is, by all accounts, pretty much in firm Chinese control. But this raises the question, I think Andrew Small would have been great for this panel, but I remember reading a very interesting statistic from his book some years ago. And that is that to move a barrel of oil through this posited G-lock from Xinjiang to Gardiner is 4 times more expensive than the most expensive internal G-lock that China has. And I very much agree with Andrew. I don't see this CPEC G-lock as being an economically viable one. I do think it's a strategic corridor. And so if this really were an economic corridor, I think we would see a lot more vigorous interest in China, Chinese interest in Afghanistan, because that's where a lot of the money remains to be tapped. And if you actually look at the amount of money, for example, that China gave to Afghanistan after the earthquake and after the massive humanitarian crisis that followed the Taliban takeover, it was like 30 million. And the Americans, despite the sanction against the Taliban, ponied up nearly 800 million. So if we actually look at what China does in the scale of what other actors are doing, I don't wake up every night thinking that we all are going to have to learn Mandarin. I'm much more worried about Pakistanis having their groundwater further depleted by growing resources, including controversial resources like pork farming, and really diminishing Pakistan's ability to take care of its own citizens. That's what worries me at night, is not, and I will also say that CPEC is the gift that keeps on giving. Every once in a while, these videos will surface of Chinese engineers very frustrated that they can't meet their hookers, and you'll find Chinese jumping up and down on the hoods of Pakistani police vehicles who are trying to protect them from, getting whacked. But instead, the Chinese contractors are much more interested in their hookers than they are their safety.
Can I just, and I'd like the other panel to think about this again, but can I put this to you, Christine, because you mentioned the memorandum of understanding that was almost to be signed with bin Laden. And now we've got similar stuff going on with Russia and other people, which gives a sort of Chinese view of how it operates in our morality sense, as it were, from Western democracies, from bin Laden to Putin and so on. A questioner who Planet Earth Calling, they name themselves. What implication does the Chinese overtures have for democracy in the developing world? Could you give us a nutshell thought on that?
I'll give you a nutshell. So first of all, I don't think the West has been a very good custodian of this planet. I also see that all of our supply chains are vertically integrated with China. Our ability to separate ourselves out from China is all but difficult. We've learned very little, if any, very few, if any, lessons from Corona, right? We still have our medicinal supply chain very directly linked into China. And I will say that as an American in particular, the fact that we have a Republican Party that actually believes that any green investments mandated by the government somehow will interfere and deprive American individual liberties to make profits to be very, very disturbing. So I don't think that if China were to become the custodian of the world, this is obviously not a world I wish to live in. But I also want to be clear that I think as an American, I'm very critical of what my country has done. I mean, I look at the invasion of Iraq on grounds that are still completely mystifying. We destroyed a country. We gave birth to ISIS. While you cannot draw a direct line from the Mujahideen to Al-Qaeda, I think had the Americans, and certainly Pakistan began its own jihad strategy in '74, I think we could make the argument that had the United States, China, Saudi, Pakistan not involved itself as it did in Afghanistan, there would not have been an Al-Qaeda. So while I certainly think that a world under Chinese custodianship that is a nightmare for me. I can also be very critical that under American stewardship, it hasn't turned out to be that great either.
Okay, so nothing is perfect. We're going to return to this because it's a very big issue, particularly what the foreign minister said yesterday, that modernization does not mean westernization, a very succinct element of what China's message is. But we are going now to Dr. Christopher Clary, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Albany, at the State University of New York, with a speciality of politics in South Asia. But on his resume, he also has the Belfer Center at Harvard University, the Rand Corporation, the Henry L. Stimson Center, the Council on Foreign Relations, so is a perfect contributor to our debate. How China's relationship in South Asia relates to its broader regional and global ambitions, what we've been talking about, and how does that reflect the broader shifts in the balance of power regionally and globally? Christopher Clary, tell us the answer to that.
Well, thank you for having me, and I enjoyed hearing the previous two presenters. I learned a lot from their presentations, and I've learned a lot from their work over the years. I'm going to sound a note of cautious optimism about the ability of China to turn investment into exploitation. So I don't have any illusions about China's benign intentions, but it is difficult to both generate economic power and then use that economic power to achieve political ends. And I think China is now going through a period where it will encounter greater difficulties for a variety of reasons. I'm going to make three major points today. And the first of which I want to make is the BRI emerged in a specific global and economic context, and that context is likely drawing to a close. Principally a period of time in which US and Western-led leadership had been impacted by the great financial crisis, which disproportionately influenced the United States and Europe, and had a lesser effect on China. And this gave China enormous resources, but also China was entering into a period where there had been overinvestment in domestic infrastructure and construction. And so China was uniquely interested in finding a way to advance economic stimulus. And so came up with, I think, a quite novel and interesting idea of using that excess money to stimulate, to buy things from Chinese firms by having them make investments overseas. So having gone through 30 years after Deng Xiaoping's opening of domestic port construction, highway construction, rail construction, building construction, those firms now then took some of their energies to other states using Chinese money that had to be paid back with interest while it was employing Chinese workers. This seemed like a good deal and also had the promise of allowing China to mitigate to some extent the Malacca dilemma it faced because of its reliance on sea lines of communication, while also perhaps tying in China's near abroad more closely to Beijing than it would otherwise in the absence of meaningful ground links, especially into Central Asia and South Asia, and then to a lesser extent, Russia. So that was the theory, and it made sense. But we're going into a period of time when I think just China's going to have less money. It's going to be less interested in using this sort of indirect stimulus package. And I won't go through all the reasons, but China itself is dealing with a property investment bubble. The experience we have in the West and in other cases is that as you unwind those property bubbles, that's going to generate economic headwinds for probably a decade under good scenarios, assuming there's not a period of acute crisis, which is possible. There's just excess capacity in the market, and Chinese investors, in the absence of a reliable welfare state and in the absence of a reliable retirement system, have placed what would otherwise go into retirement into these apartments. And in many cases, these apartments may not exist or may not be worth anything. And now that money that's generated all the problems that property bubbles generate that again, Europeans and Americans are acutely aware of because of the experiences of the last decade. China is exiting out of the period in which it has a demographic dividend. Now China is graying. The median age in China is almost exactly the same as the median age of the United States. But China has the unique problem of being a country that has grayed, has gotten old before it got wealthy. This is maybe a world unique situation, good, in a way that's good that China was able to keep its elderly population alive for so long. But now you have all these old Chinese that are around trying to figure out that are creating drains on their society. The welfare state is imperfect. That the absence of a credible and meaningful welfare state means that people have to stay at home to take care of the old people, and that then has implications for China's labor participation rate, which produces limitations on how much China can achieve economically. So you have those headwinds amidst the global geopolitical turmoil that has greeted a decade of Xi Jinping's more activist and I would say aggressive foreign policy. So, that there is going to be modest decoupling with China. And that's in part because the hourly cost of a Chinese worker has reached pretty high levels compared to alternative providers in Vietnam and Southeast Asia and even in India, which has been a laggard in this regard. And that's going to also mean that net exports are going to be a less meaningful propellant to the Chinese economy than they were in the period of time from 1979 to, say, 2015. We're already, I should know, have really good reasons to believe that for the last decade, Chinese GDP statistics have been inflated. And then on top of that, because of this rise of the cost of a Chinese worker and getting widgets out of Chinese factories, there's real concerns that China may be entering into a period of that, economists sometimes refer to as a middle income trap, that it can't get up the value ladder enough to wind up in a high income status. All of that means that we're, I think, going to have many years of Chinese economic growth in sort of the 4% range. Now, that will exceed probably what Europe or the US can achieve, but it may not exceed what Bangladesh, Vietnam, India can achieve. And that relative balance of economic power then will make, I think, China have less ability to fund generous BRI, but also mean that some of the other states will be less interested in those Chinese investments. And you should say all of this is true, even if you're not optimistic about India's growth prospects, but it is at least plausible that you could have a very long period of accelerated Indian economic growth. Even if you don't buy into sort of the most optimistic takes of the Modi regime supporters, it is over the next decade, 2 decades, you could have 6% economic growth in India, exceeding the Chinese number. And that means India will have more money to invest in this near abroad, creating another financial alternative to Chinese investment and debt that wasn't present in the previous decade of 2010 to 2020. So the period of kind of peak BRI could be passing us by, and other forms of financing might be available, and that will minimize the ability for China to turn investment into exploitation. The second line of argument that I want to focus on today has been hinted at a little bit by Christine, but I want to draw it out a little bit more, which is large outside economic, social, or political pressure on any society generates antibodies to that pressure. Nationalism remains the most powerful force in international politics, and it is hard for states to turn leverage into political changes that are favorable to them without locals being quite upset. So as China's own memories of a century of humiliation demonstrates, external economic intervention can quickly become to be perceived as exploitation. And those nationalist responses will limit the ability for exploitation to really secure political ends. And Christine mentioned, and I also have noted repeatedly in the press for the last decade, stories of Chinese citizens misbehaving overseas. When you have large expatriate populations, they get into trouble. They get in trouble with the law. They get in trouble in Muslim societies trying to buy pork, trying to do other things that Christine was mentioning. They get into traffic accidents. They run over people. They want to not be held accountable by local laws. And all of that pisses people off. And the US has been the recipient of that anger for many years, but it is not the only state where these dynamics in play. And China will not be immune. And Chinese expatriates have not proven a great willingness to integrate and blend into the societies in which they're operating. And very large investment footprints with engineers and construction workers are not the sort of things that are going to be ignored by locals. So these investments are all going into societies that have pre-existing political cleavages on partisan, ethnic, linguistic, or religious grounds. And locally, there is acute concern that Chinese investments are favoring other groups. And so it exacerbates these pre-existing cleavages and makes Chinese investment a political football. And there are finite resources, even for a state like China, and they cannot manage these things perfectly. So, already in societies that have large Chinese debt holdings, we see signs of backlash. And I think that will only get worse, especially if China does not improve its reputation as being a more magnanimous donor than it has been thus far. So we did some polling in Punjab province in Pakistan in 2018, my co-authors and I, and we just asked, do you know about CPEC? Everybody really, to first approximation, 75-80% of the Punjabi respondents knew about CPEC, at least a little bit. And then we asked, well, what do you think it will do? What do you think it will improve the Pakistani economy? Well, many of them did, majority did, in fact. But maybe 40% were worried. About 33% of the sample thought that it would improve the Pakistani economy, but would allow China to dominate the Pakistani economy. And then another, 7-8% or so thought that it might not even improve the Pakistani economy in the process. So when you have a minority, but a substantial minority, skeptical of investments, and I should emphasize, as Christine, I think, alluded to, Punjab province, in a way, is going to be the most supportive of any of Pakistan's large population centers of a thing like CPEC, compared to poor Shia communities in Gilgit and Baltistan, or in other marginalized communities in Balochistan or Sindh or in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So these antibodies will generate backlash, and we've seen targeted attacks on China in Pakistan, and I think will continue. And Christine talked a little bit about the Islamic State in Afghanistan. I think that will be a problem that China will have to contend with. And as you deal with it, does China decide to do a greater security force presence? Well, that will also generate backlash, as the U.S. knows from decades of being a global power. There's an old line that if you owe the bank $100,000, that's your problem. But if you owe the bank $1 million or $1 billion, and that's the bank's problem. And China has to contend with that as well. It can't allow these states to default on its investments. It may have riders in the contract that give it access to port revenue. Those are actually quite hard to enforce without going through some sort of colonialism. And colonialism is not normatively acceptable in the modern era. It's going to be hard for them to actually do it in practice. You're not going to invade a country to make sure they pay their port revenues. This isn't like the Marines aren't going to Haiti to collect the custom houses anymore. I don't think China will be doing that in the country. So a lot of these riders, I think, are going to be unenforceable in practice. And these antibodies are going to be something that China has to contend with. The U.S. has a lot of trouble turning its financial leverage into meaningful political outcomes. And I don't think China is going to be much, much better than other great powers have been historically. Okay. The reason I am cautiously optimistic is because I do think there are real limitations that do emerge from Chinese investment overseas. And that's my third line of inquiry, which is that multipolarity, and you could maybe even imagine bipolarity. You might think that China is much stronger, much economically more important than the next most important great power. But when there are contending great powers that will give states options that they are going to want to try to navigate and exploit. Now, they may, regional or minor powers may be too clever by half. They may think they can exploit great power enmity more than they can. Frédéric alluded to this possibility in his comments, but it is going to give states options. And that principally means that the Western-led international community is probably going to have less leverage to deal with troublesome states than it did during the period of peak Western coercive ability, which was in the 1990s. So troublesome states, the Myanmars, Afghanistan of the world, that are not necessarily avowed everyday enemies of the Western-led order, like North Korea or Iran, those troublesome states are going to have options, and it will be difficult for the U.S. to build a crushing sanctions regime to punish them for atrocities they may commit at home, human rights violations they may commit at home, illiberties that they may take with their citizens. U.S. leverage to deal with that will be less, because the U.S. Both objectively has less relative influence, because they can go to China, they can go to India, which may have different sets of normative concerns in these places, and they can go conceivably, depending on the aftermath of the Ukraine war, to Russia to get financing. And so it will be hard for the U.S. to push these states to the degree that it did in the 1990s. And then the U.S., for its own part, will probably hold its fire, maybe more than it should. U.S. officials are quite wary of using the levers that they have. Seems like I get emotional about this, but that's not true. And they are worried once they pull a lever, it will no longer be available to them. They're especially worried about pushing states into adversary camps. And that's going to restrain US willingness to use the coercion that it has at its fingertips. And that will just make life easier for undemocratic regimes to do bad things at home and abroad. That is a real constraint of China's rise in this move to multipolarity, but that is a function of the system rather than any Chinese strategy. That's just what multipolarity does. And there will be occasions in which the intensity of great power disputes leads to proxy competitions. Those could be violent, or those could be through political shenanigans. You know, the minor powers are going to be wary of that. Nobody wants to be Mossadegh or Arbenz or Bao Dai, right? No one wants to invite a great power competition that could overthrow the political elements in their countries. But that does happen. Miscalculations do occur in that way. So all of that, those three lines of analysis, that the Chinese economy is likely to grow at a much lower rate than it did for the prior 3 decades, that Chinese influence is likely to generate local antibodies, but that multipolarity will give bad regimes options that they did not have in prior decades. All of that leads me to the cautious optimism that I tried to convey here today. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for that, Christopher Clary. It seemed, I mean, just encapsulating it, which you've just done, the superpowers will be less super powerful, both of them, than they are, and Russia as well. Which brings me to 2 questions that have come in that I'll group together. One from Dr. K.K. Hubbdahai. Does the debt trap diplomacy narrative hold water, given that nations such as Sri Lanka have a problem with debt management? This is the internal governance of these countries. But then Jugendra Patak says, given India's historic ties and influence with countries such as Maldives, Bangladesh, and Nepal, how easy would it be for China to extend its own influence into these countries? Could you give us an encapsulation of your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, overnight, it looks like the Sri Lankan government was able to give assurances from China to the IMF that it would restructure some of the debt that China has provided to Sri Lanka historically. And that is, I think, a sign that the international financial institutions are aware of this problem, right? Like the IMF and the World Bank don't want to get in the business of bailing out Chinese loans, allowing China to reap a high interest rates. And they are not, they may not be perfect, but they're aware of this problem and they're going to put pressure on it. And it's going to be difficult for countries, especially countries like Sri Lanka, which the international community some countries are too big to fail. And there's lots of countries like Sri Lanka where the international community are fine with letting them go through a period of acute hardship. And those countries aren't going to be able to manipulate the Western financial institutions into extraordinarily generous packages. Now, there are states like Pakistan that are going to be better at maneuvering in that space. But the number of those countries, that, especially those that don't have like nuclear weapons, is a pretty small list. But I do think part of the reason, that negotiations with Sri Lanka have gone better is because India and the United States have similar concerns about Chinese influence. And that will, I think, constrain what China can do, especially if India grows. Now, it is tough to know what is going to go off the Indian growth story. The Indian government, I think, is excessively optimistic about the prospects there. But Chinese headwinds are real, and India will be a beneficiary of international investors skeptical of China. And that means the relative economic balance of power is going, I think, to probably favor India over a 10 or 20-year time horizon. India won't be a larger economy than China, but it'll be larger in relative terms. And that means that the influence is, I think, we had this period of kind of peak influence in the 2010s that I think is fading.
Thank you for encapsulating that for us. We have a couple of questions in on the Quad, which I'm going to put to the panel generally at the end of it, because the Quad is this value-based, like-minded rivalry thing which encapsulates what we're talking about. But we're going to finish our panelists with Pervez Hoodbhoy, who is a nuclear physicist, an activist, a national security analyst, and a distinguished track record in academia, such that 10 years ago, Foreign Policy magazine included him among the 100 most influential global thinkers. He is going to talk to us about the magnitude that he thinks, or the limits of China's influence on Pakistan. And Pakistan is this big key player, both in South Asia and on the China influence there. China's influence on Pakistan at geopolitical, economic, and cultural. Pervez Hoodbhoy, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Humphrey. Pleasure to see you again. I'm sorry I'm joining late, but it was beyond my control. I did hear Professor Clary. Unfortunately, I missed the speakers earlier. My canvas is going to be rather small. It'll be drawn principally from my experiences and my assessment on the limits of Pakistan-China engagement, which I expressed in a Dawn article published 3 weeks ago called "Don't Blame the Chinese." Normally, the Chinese do not react to what is published in Pakistani newspapers, but the Chinese Consul General chose to write a riposte, which said whatever I'd said in that was incorrect, but he did not actually put his finger on what it was that I wrote, which is incorrect. But let me give you a quick summary of that. Well, there were great expectations that Pakistan's economy would be utterly transformed by CPEC. And to this date, $62.5 billion Chinese investment has been made in Pakistan. Much of this has gone into infrastructure, which is roads, bridges, overpasses, underpasses, and electricity generation, principally. The hope was that this would bring a new era in Pakistan's economic development, but as we can see from the present situation, nothing of that sort has happened. In fact, Pakistan is now in a state of default, and it is still seeking a miserable $1.1 billion IMF bailout, which it hopes will save it for at least another few months. But then the question is, what happens next? So why didn't it work? Well, my contention in the article was that infrastructure is insufficient. You've got to have governance and you've got to have human capital. Both of these were absent. And so no matter what the intention of the Chinese was, good or bad, it hasn't worked. Governance, because we just don't know how much of this investment was used where, what were the terms of the agreement, what was the interest rate, where was it going? Now, much of this was in the hands of the Pakistan army, which insisted on being the controlling authority of CPEC. And you can see that indeed the infrastructure has been built with army companies, the Frontier Corps, the FCO, the Fauji Foundation, and so forth. And it's also clear that it's only been infrastructure that has been developed, that local industry has failed, that one doesn't have any evidence of new industries sprouting anywhere in Pakistan. Local employment has been small, and it has been essentially for labor. There has not been high-level participation. And so one way that was thought out of it was to send Pakistani students to China. And this I mentioned in my article, and I said that 30,000 of them have been sent there, but that too hasn't produced any significant result. In fact, I do know that several of my university students, in fact, people that I taught while they were undergraduates, went there. Unfortunately, they didn't acquire the sort of skills that would be necessary for employability, and that by far. This in the engineering fields, this in the scientific fields, the others I don't know, but these are the fields that really matter. As I said, my canvas is going to be rather narrow, but perhaps it'll be of interest to you to know that I have just returned from Gwadar. Gwadar is the seaport which was developed by the Chinese. It's the gateway into the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, which was really what used to be said was the target of the Soviet Union. And through accessing the warm waters of the Arabian Sea, the Soviet Union would expand its influence. Well, whatever that argument now has come to mean, the fact is that the Chinese are very much there. But they're there and invisible. As you go along, you see massive fortifications, you see bunkers, you see little forts on the tops of hills with machine guns pointed down everywhere along the CPEC highways, as well as side roads leading to them. And the Chinese are very sequestered. They have very little interaction with the rest of the population. In fact, there are people in Gwadar who have not seen a Chinese at all. Nevertheless, there's a full-fledged port there. The port is rather empty, I must say. I asked how many ships have entered this in the last 10 days, and the answer was 3. And this is far from the dream that was once sold to Pakistan, that this would become the Dubai of Pakistan. It turns out that shipping has, of course, decreased in Karachi as well, because the impending default means that ships are no longer willing to unload their containers. Even the ones which have made it to Karachi are not willing to unload their containers unless they are paid for the freight charge in dollars, and there are no dollars left. So perhaps it is not unusual that only 3 ships have been seen there in the last several days. But even if the dollars come about, I am actually quite bewildered by how this could have been sold as a port that would compete with Dubai. It's 660 kilometers from Karachi, which is really the gateway to Pakistan. And the road is not a level road. It's called the coastal highway, but it goes through very mountainous areas. And there you can see why there are so many fortifications, checkposts at every point. So it seems to me, and it seems now to practically everyone, I mean, there are very few people who would maintain that CPEC has delivered its promises. Well, those promises were extravagant, but one could have hoped for a lot better than what one is seeing today. We do have now from China a $30 billion loan to pay. And the interest on that, unfortunately, no one knows. Probably the state bank now knows. Earlier on, the state bank would request from the CPEC authorities details of what were the transactions carried out, and that information was denied. But I think this is one of the good things that the IMF has done. It has forced the government to instruct every one of its organs that they better come clear on what the terms of the agreement were. It's one thing to have agreements at the state-to-state level, but there are also a lot of Chinese companies and Chinese banks which are involved, and they're involved to very different degrees. And I'm sure that the accountancy of this must be pretty complex. I'd say one thing that was expected but didn't happen, which was that the Chinese would have a lot of, over time, cultural influence in Pakistan. That has proved to be too difficult. Now, let me say that this is not for lack of trying, because the Chinese language was introduced into a number of schools. It was implemented to a degree, but then from what I hear, it's pretty much petered out. Well, it's a difficult language to learn. There's very little cultural contact between Pakistanis and Chinese. And the Chinese don't feel comfortable. They have also not tried very hard to learn the local language, Urdu, or any of the other languages in the regions in which they operate. And so the distance has been pretty much constant. There's been no reduction in it that I can see. Looking into the future, I don't see CPEC fulfilling its promises. I don't see China's influence in Pakistan growing to the extent that many had surmised. It is being seen even in the upper levels of government in Pakistan and the army that the United States cannot be totally alienated. And this in spite of the fact that Imran Khan had said that he was removed by the United States. He's pretty much has had to take that back and blame it onto an army general, General Bajwa. Should he come back to power, which appears very likely, I think he will be forced by circumstances not to make such statements again, and perhaps put a bit of distance between himself and the Taliban, with which he was so closely associated with. So in conclusion, I'll say that the Chinese are probably rethinking their relationship with Pakistan. It's not proved to be that rosy. And as attacks upon Chinese workers in Pakistan have proved, they don't feel safe, and they're probably wanting to go home. And I don't see this relationship as growing. It's unfortunate, in my opinion, that this has happened, because there is a great deal that Pakistan could learn from China. It's not just the technology, but also the way in which they work. I mean, their work ethic, their hard work, which is actually one thing that Pakistanis now deeply admire, having watched them from close. But well, I guess that's the way things are. That's all I have to say. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Pervez. And it's a very vivid picture you painted about the language or lack of it, the lack of cultural contact. The machine guns that you saw on the high fences, is that the Chinese military or are they private Chinese security companies?
No. It is the Pakistan army. And the Pakistan army is all over Balochistan. And this is actually one of the, that is a basic source of resentment of the Baloch. They think, and well, I don't blame them, that they feel they're colonized by Punjab and the rest of Pakistan, well, basically by the Punjab. The security points are ubiquitous. You're stopped here, you stop there, you stop there. And between Gwadar and Karachi, 660 kilometers, I think we were stopped in 20 places. But it's even worse than that. when you go into Gwadar, so I went from a place called Turbat, you see these machine gun nests everywhere. And I actually stopped at a point and engaged with an army officer over there, and had a long conversation with him. He wasn't happy at being there. He was a very bright young man, and he wanted to get out of there. But he said, "Look, we have to be here, otherwise the terrorists will attack all the assets that we have over here." Now, this is a kind of classic colonial argument.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, the picture that seems to be emerging from this discussion, that China's reach is very limited from a number of reasons. They won't have so much money, they're unpopular, and this sort of thing. Amit Rana asks a question, I wonder if you might address it. How might nations such as Pakistan and Sri Lanka strengthen their own political systems so that they're less susceptible to China's influence?
Well, I don't know about Sri Lanka. That's a completely different situation. But Pakistan has always relied upon its geopolitical situation. So earlier on, it was the United States, which Pakistan heavily leaned upon, and the United States, because it wanted to fight the Soviet Union everywhere and anywhere, it was a very comfortable alliance. The Pakistanis say that we were used by the United States, and the United States said that Pakistan wanted to be used. So that's the way it was until 2020, when the US completely lost interest, or was it when the Taliban took over, August of 2021? Yeah. So after that, US interest in Pakistan has essentially evaporated. And
but is it strong enough? I mean, Pakistan's the big one, but we've mentioned Bangladesh here, which Sri Lanka's come up, Nepal, of course. Are these nations going to be strong enough to build fair institutions that can actually be a front against anybody that's coming in and trying to influence them?
This is the big question. And now there is a huge uncertainty within Pakistan. In fact, young people that I've been talking to today have been so depressed. Most would flee the country if they could, but of course they cannot. Some will still try. There's a huge youth bulge. Most of them don't have skills because the education system didn't equip them with that. There's so much religion that is thrust into education that there has been little time and space left over for critical thinking, for science, math, etc. And so they're seriously skill deficient, and now they do realize that, and yet they're powerless because that's how the state made them be.
So to answer that question, it's not happening. And a very detailed question you might not be able to answer. So Seng Hasnam Sering says that Ukraine is putting China in an uncomfortable situation vis-a-vis relations with Russia. Gilgit in South Asia is another piece where China-Russia relations will be tested. Have you got a comment on that?
On Ukraine? Well,
no, not on Ukraine. On Gilgit, this patch specifically where China and Russia come face to face.
Okay, Gilgit. On the Karakoram Highway, you see Chinese influence into the next 50 miles or so, but then once you leave the Gilgit area and you come down, then the Chinese are of course in the big cities, but where they live they live in different places over there. They don't socialize with others. They cannot because of security concerns. And so, yeah, you could say that you can occasionally see Chinese in Gilgit-Baltistan. There, because they work on the highway, they've done a fantastic job over there, I must say, and they need it there all the time because the mountains keep crumbling. It's a very unstable geological area.
Again, it's infrastructure building, isn't it? I'm now going to open up to the panel to do a question. There's a couple of questions in that deal with the Quad, and I'll go around the panel in the order that everybody spoke to have some thoughts on that, because this is this balance of the rival powers, as the Chinese foreign minister said yesterday. Modernization does not mean westernization, and I'd like some views on that as well. Philip Bowman asks, the Quad should counter Chinese influence in South Asia by focusing on key areas such as vaccine provision and climate issues. Is that what the Quad is really for? Rashid Ali, now that ties between members of the Quad are becoming even stronger, what will be the future impact of this alliance upon the balance of power between India and China? Some encapsulating thoughts on that. I think we can go to our first speaker, Frédéric Grare. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, the Quad will be about what the Quad wants to be about. And I just want to recall that the Quad, in a way, is adapted, which was not much at the very beginning in 2007, has become much more focused in 2017, and is now gradually taking the measure of the threat. And the threat is of a hybrid nature, precisely. And therefore, the Quad is reacting with elements of influence, such as the vaccines, climate change, for all the reasons that we have already discussed in the presentations, and so on and so forth. So as to what the Quad should or should not do, I think this is fairly open, and I think this is fairly adjusted. Whether the Quad will be able to do all that, this is a different story. Now, if the implicit question is, should the Quad focus on military issues, essentially, well, I think that's a misunderstanding, because having India in it, there is clearly a willingness not to go in that direction and not to be overtly hostile or very confrontational vis-a-vis China. That's where we stand. Now, I don't remember your other questions, but I mean, I'm sure that somebody else will be willing to answer them.
And the Quad, of course, it sort of represents, like-minded democratic values, for want of a better thing. And it's also putting together some packages to counter the Belt and Road, Japan and India, particularly in aid. So is the Quad investment or exploitation?
Well, I don't think, very honestly, I don't think that the Quad can be described as exploitation. And by Quad, we should include all the larger Indo-Pacific strategies, because they all have one thing in common, which is they want to offer options. I mean, what the Indo-Pacific is about is to get away from an exclusive relationship with China on the one side and mesh the space in order to make sure that China and Josephine can be, the term contain is not really the one I'm looking for, but I mean, for lack of a better word, I'll use it. Contain and brought about to be in line with standards, standards of international behavior that we're all comfortable with. This is what the whole thing is about. So, I mean, and everybody knows it's inherently cooperative, because nobody has the means to do that by itself. Now, this is options which are put on the table with a lot of difficulty, by the way, but which are gradually emerging. And this is for the states who want to participate to be part of it. So I don't see how it could be described as exploitation. Is that investment? Yes, up to a point. But again, this is an investment that we'll still have to see where it goes.
Okay, thank you for that. Christine Fair, give us your thoughts on the Quad. What should it be doing? Is it investment or exploitation?
Well, I'm not going to engage the premise of that debate, because I actually don't think the Quad does that much. And I also don't think that the Quad is ever going to be able to do that much. So I am not a Quad enthusiast nor pessimist. I just look at what the actual interests are and what the capabilities of each of the states are. And I don't particularly find the Quad to be that impressive of an organization. So I perhaps have a different view from others on this panel, but that's kind of where I am on it. I'm not putting my bets on the Quad.
Okay, so I find that particularly interesting, because if the Quad isn't doing much, and we've heard generally in this discussion that China is
I see Chris making an interesting face. I want to know what Chris's views are on.
Yeah, well,
But
I'm
look,
going to come to it in a second, but I want your views on this, Christine. Is that China's sort of pulling back? The US isn't doing as much.
What is Australia? Let me just be really blunt here. I mean, what is Australia capable of doing? What is India capable of doing? And I'll be really blunt here as well. I've been studying India for a really, really long time. And I go back to some of my earlier writings. They hold up really well. The problem with India in defense modernization is that it's really not capable of doing defense modernization at all. And I come to this point of view simply looking at the bureaucracy of India. I look at the dialogue that India is incapable of having with itself about, and not only with itself, I'm talking about interagency cooperation. If you look at the way India does defense acquisition, it's not driven in a way that many of us would consider to be consistent with the threats that it faces. A lot of people focus on the womb to tomb social security net of the Indian armed forces. I'm much more interested in the way it does logistics. Most modern militaries of any consequence do not overinvest in, for example, take a look at the different air platforms that India has for essentially the same core mission, medium range, a multi-role combat aircraft. Most countries don't have 7 or 8 different platforms, all of which have their own logistical tail, none of which is shareable, right? So the way India does defense modernization is the antithesis of modernization. And so the United States has for a really long time bet on the Indian horse. And I've sat there on the sideline saying, I'm not putting my money on this bet, because the bureaucracy of India cannot sustain what everyone is hoping it is able to do. And I'll also note, I really question the premise that we all have shared values. We don't have shared values right now. I mean, what astonishes me is that your average Indian is not more horrified about what is happening on the border with China. The current government has massively been able to underreport the scale of Chinese incursions. He doesn't give press conferences. He never fields questions. So, if we're really banking on the Quad doing anything, we're going to need the Indians to really substantively change the way they do business. And that's probably not going to happen in my lifetime. It might happen within Chris's. And I also don't really see the Australians being terribly capable. So you tell me, and I think the Americans are going through a really, really tough time right now. And that is going to be a lot tougher if Republicans take the White House. So I don't feel very strong saying that we have shared values. And I certainly don't see that we have shared interest in aligning our capabilities to do similar things, because our capabilities are simply not alignable right now.
That's a really interesting, straightforward view. Dr. Christopher Clary, your views on the Quad and that?
You know what? It's maybe no surprise, but I am probably closer to Christine than I am and a lot of other people on these issues. It is good the Quad exists. It is helpful to have a forum that these countries can coordinate with one another and have some very nice meetings with a lot of nice imagery. But it's hard. It's really hard to do coordination, to put up meaningful amounts of money and expertise. And it is hard for countries that in some cases only have niche areas of real advantage. Australia is a small country at some level in terms of population that does have unique advantages in Southeast Asia, and obviously as a place from which to base military capabilities has a lot. But Australia is not going to be a game changer if you're worried about protecting from investment or exploitation, right? It's just Australia's not a financial powerhouse. Now Japan's an aging society but does still have a lot of heft. But for both Japan and the U.S., private firms making business case decisions move a lot of that money around. And the government, especially the Japanese government, can nudge those firms in important ways. But the real money that comes from the U.S. and Japan is not controlled by the governments in those places. It's firms trying to maximize profit, which is a goal that the government shares. And India does have more ability to nudge its private industry than maybe the other Quad partners, but is still a growing society. And I think, what have we seen out of the Quad? You look at the success stories. They point to the vaccines, but it's not clear to me in the absence of a Quad that vaccine policy for those states would be meaningfully different. Those countries would have wound up at, I think, a pretty similar place of being somewhat generous, but somewhat non-generous. And I don't know if the Quad dramatically changed things. We are in what people, I guess, now in DC refer to as a plurilateral environment. You have these different constructions of polygons, and each side of the polygon had, people like, oh, they're thicker or thinner. But what that means is diplomats have to go around to meetings all day. I2, U2, Quad, trilaterals between everybody. Yeah. Now, India has a very small foreign service, which I think which complicates its ability to do these coordinations. You deal with any large firm, and it is hard to coordinate across people, right? The software engineers have this idea called the mythical man month, that you can't just throw additional labor hours because coordination has a cost of its own. And so I do think the Quad is it is useful to coordinate these functions. It does help on the margin, but it is an evolutionary improvement and not a revolutionary one. And it's just evolutionary plurilateral bodies that kind of help on the margins. But the big structural features, like if you wanted to design a body that was going to stop Chinese investment or exploitation, it'd probably be the US and Europeans building such a body, right? That is those people, there's more habits of cooperation. Maybe bring the Japanese in. So again, we shouldn't oversell the Quad. It's good it happens. It's good there are meetings, but it does have its limitations.
Thank you for that. That's US and European back in Asia. That's that old colonial mindset or horror story or whatever you want to call it, but a truth from Christopher there. I'm going to go around each of you very quickly, starting with Pervez and then working round again. Just 2 words, please. The title of our debate is China in South Asia, Investment or Exploitation. Pervez, investment, exploitation, or something else?
Well, couldn't we have asked the same question about the United States back in the time of the Cold War? It was
a good question.
We could have asked the very same thing then.
Yes,
countries which are able to look after their national assets and benefit from investment, and those which become subservient then pay the cost.
Thank you. Frédéric Grare, in China in South Asia, investment or exploitation or something else?
Both, obviously. China is pursuing its own interests and it invests and exploits whenever it can.
Okay. Christine, fair.
Look, if China finds a way to get stuff out of the ground in Afghanistan, that's just awesome. But again, I'm not a betting person anyways because I don't have a poker face, but I'm still.
Okay, and Christopher Clary, China in South Asia, investment or exploitation?
Well, you can have a money-losing investment, but also as the kids say, why not both, right? You can have investment that's going to give you some ability to exploit, but there are real limits. And the Chinese are not going to change the game on great power politics with regional and minor powers. Those limits are present for everyone, and the Chinese are not excluded from those challenges.
Thank you for that. That is a very clear conclusion, but we haven't yet concluded, because now is the time, as we draw to the end of the Democracy Forum debate, to bring in the wisdom of our chair, Barry Gardiner MP, who is steeped in the ups and downs of South Asia and who's been listening in. Barry, what do you make of our discussion?
Oh dear, right. Humphrey, steeped in wisdom, I don't think. I think the title has been very well answered in the final questions that you posed by Pervez and Frédéric and Chris and so on, saying, look, of course, you could ask exactly the same question of the US, and that was drawn out earlier in the discussion. Totally correct to say that every country is pursuing their own interests, as Frédéric said, and China's pursuing both. It's pursuing its interest in terms of an investment, but of course it's going to take advantage of any defaults in terms of exploitation that it can. It's about national self-interest, and I particularly like Chris's investments can also lose money. Absolutely correct. And I think it was significant that he said, look, it's not changing the game with respect to the interplay between the large and the minor powers. I thought it was interesting that at the end you focused our panel's attention on the Quad, and again got a very interesting response, I thought. What is the Quad? You know, does anybody know what the Quad is for, or how it achieves it? It seemed to me that what Christine was telling us was, it's a statement. It doesn't do that much. India can't do defense modernization at all, came up in that section. 7 out of the 8 platforms not integrated. I thought that was a fascinating insight into the lack of capacity that the Quad might actually have. And I thought it was also significant to talk about no shared values. Goodness me, the United States doesn't have shared values in and within itself, never mind the Quad as a whole. Yeah, but I thought we probably got further in answering your questions on the Quad than we did on investment and exploitation. Charles, as always, set us off with some really good facts and set out that context very ably, I thought. Significant facts that I came away much the wiser for were the loans to grants statistic that he said of 31 to 1 loan to grant, the statistics. Now, of course, that doesn't tell you how much the loans were or indeed how much the grants were, and that might cloud one's or change one's interpretation of that statistic, but nonetheless, it is an interesting one. But he also made a very clear focus on the quantum of ODI that's coming out of Beijing at $85 billion, which again, hugely significant, I think. And he linked it again with the military in Bangladesh, and also the whole issue of debt and default that we then went on to consider. So China's money goes either to those who can repay, in which case it's a good investment, or to those who fail, but where China can achieve strategic advantage, geopolitical advantage, which you may say is exploitation. It may be simply in the extraction of minerals and other things that, consumables. But either way, China would appear to gain if the failure and the failure to honor the debt means that it can exercise that strategic advantage. Frédéric spoke again of that mixture of military and economic threat. He talked about his three tiers, talked about the stability, that way in which China wanted a certain stability in the region that meant that its rivalry with India directed China to keep stability with India's neighbors and to ensure that its relationship with the USA was their relationship with the USA was undermining India's relationship with it. So the US-India, US-South Asia, and India-South Asia, different elements of China's strategy there that he outlined, and spoke of China expanding its influence through every sector of activity, not just commercial, but environment as well. He spoke, of course, of the Hambantota, the port in Sri Lanka, the strategic element of value that China was extracting from its relationship with Sri Lanka. And of course, it was there that he said, this is not a fight between the good versus the ugly. It's about national interest. And at that point, I'd put an asterisk and simply reminded myself that in 2020, the IMF found that 36 of the 70 low-income countries were either in or at high risk of debt distress. You look at Argentina, you look at Ecuador at the period, and of course, it's always been a feature of Western economic power that for its debt defaulters, it extracts certain demands and certain constraints that they then impose on those countries. China, in that sense, is no different. And it was then we moved to Dr. Fair, Professor Fair, China's involvement with Afghanistan, talking about the way, interestingly, how that went back more than 20 years as then the major investor, how they'd used their own Uyghur populations then within that fight with Russia. And again, an interesting fact, I certainly was unaware of China building Afghan's telecoms network, such as it was. But that close connectivity between China and Osama bin Laden at the time. She spoke of the investments, the Madara gas basin investment, the mining investment, and I think it was pretty clear that China wasn't getting much return on those investments, but did speak of Pakistan's agricultural trade, which benefited and fed the Chinese population on the other side of that equation. Dr. Clary introduced that note of cautious optimism, difficult to generate economic power and use it for political purposes at the same time. I wasn't so sure that was necessarily the case. It may, I think many countries, the UK in its day included, have done just that. They've generated the economic power and used it for political purposes. I think, a history of the 19th century would certainly tend to make you think so. But he pointed out some very clear constraints in the way in which China was able to capitalize on the investments that it was making and its economic power. Spoke about how the BRI had emerged in a time of the US-EU financial crisis, and of course, significantly at the time of China's overproduction, its overcapacity, and the need that it then had to stimulate its overseas exports. And I think it was really perceptive and helpful for him to say, look, that period is drawing to a close, and China's property investment bubble, they're having their own problems that led to the global financial crisis in 2008 in the US and the West. He spoke of China's aggressive policy era, now sees Chinese wages drawing parallels to outside countries, and of course that whole change in expectation within the country is of significance as well. And he, I think, was the first to talk about how accelerated Indian economic growth might again constrain China's capacity to turn investment into exploitation. So difficult to turn economic advantage to exploitation as populations resent and resist the Chinese laborers was a point that he drew out. So I think he had 3 strands. This was the second of them. He spoke of that backlash that there was in those communities where there had been Chinese overseas labor, and the skepticism that people felt about whether it was actually benefiting their economy or not. And his third point, I think, was around the multipolarity issue, gives states options and therefore less ability for either China or indeed the West as an investor to leverage that investment in the way that they might wish to. And he pointed out that again constrained China's rise, but he thought might increase the minor powers' ability to go rogue from the world order with pretty catastrophic effects for or impacts on their own populations, Sri Lanka probably being a very good example of that in recent years. And again, emphasize that Indian growth will be a limiting factor upon China. Now, Dr. Hoodbhoy, he said he painted on a small canvas, but he painted in great detail, I thought, that canvas of Pakistan and China's relations. And I thought it was really interesting to have his very recent experiences of going down to Gardiner and seeing for himself, well, yes, those military installations there, the tensions that there were within Pakistan, the tensions that there were obviously with the former prime minister, and we'll see whether there is a return or not. But I thought when he said CPEC has not transformed the Pakistan economy despite that $62 billion investment, and Pakistan is still in huge debt. His point that you need governance and there is no transparency within the system in Pakistan, and you're not getting the governance that is required in order to make these investments in infrastructure actually come to the benefit of the economy as a whole, because there's been a total failure in terms of education, in terms of science, and the education system to produce the industries and the companies that are going to be able to take advantage of that infrastructure investment. He spoke obviously about the geographical dislocation of Gardiner from Karachi as the gateway into the rest of the country, that 660 kilometers that had to be compensated for, if you like. And said, look, there's a $30 billion debt that Pakistan has to pay here. The cultural influence, he said, had not happened, and Chinese expats have failed to integrate. So, yes, it may be the case that Pakistan military and Pakistan politicians are wary about alienating the United States, but he said that China will probably be rethinking their investment. Certainly, they may be looking at it and, as one of your panel said in summing up, thinking that it was one in which they lost money rather than benefited or exploited anybody. But how sad that we finished up by talking about too many young people wanting to get out of that country, but being powerless to, because they have not been educated in science, in technology, in mathematics, but they have been over-educated, one might say, in religion.
Barry, that is a sobering note to end on. So I just want to ask you one question before we go. It's really what Foreign Minister Chin said this morning. how should we as liberal democrats react to him describing China as a force for global stability and prosperity, inspiring modernization around the world? Do you agree with that?
No, unsurprisingly, I don't. Look, I think the point that was repeatedly made by your panelists was a very good one. China is acting, as pretty much every other country in the world does, in its own interest. And as long as we understand that is the basis of international relations, you can form alliances, but don't mistake them for friendships. You can share common projects and programs for a period of time, but don't make the mistake of thinking that these are long-lasting, endearing, special relationships. Be realistic that each country acts in its own domestic interest. That's what politicians are elected to do. Now, some do it, some actually act in their own private interests. And where you see kleptocracies like Sri Lanka, where you see the military actually seizing control of the polity, as I would suggest Pakistan is a very good example of, then that's when things go awry. Politics, is the mechanism by which countries are supposed to ensure that they act in their own interest, but they're supposed to act in the public interest. The politicians are supposed to act in the public interest for everyone in that society, not for a captive group.
Good. Let us end on that note then, as opposed to the rather sobering one you left us with before. And we are over time, but what a lot of ground we covered and conclusions we drew. Read about all of these issues and much more in our sister magazine, Asian Affairs. In the latest issues, it talks about a new global charter, which could be drawn up with the way that India and US rivalry is happening. And then on Monday, the 24th, tentatively at 2 p.m. British time, we have 72 years of China's colonial rule in Tibet as our next Democracy Forum debate. Thank you, Frédéric Grare, Pervez Hoodbhoy, Christine Fair, Christopher Clary. Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, for so skillfully giving us our backdrop, and Barry Gardiner for your just insights and conclusions just now. From me, Humphrey Hawksley, and the team at Asian Affairs and the Democracy Forum, thank you all for being here, and until next month, goodbye.